Welcome back to the Unlearning Circle. We're talking again today about issues of mental health. And today we're going to be going through ACEs and AREs. Carl will be breaking these things down. But before we hop into it, just a reminder, you can find us on Facebook. Look for our Facebook group, The Unlearning Podcast. And the same, if you're wanting to reach out to us, theunlearningpodcast@gmail.com.
Unlearning
Curve. What am I saying? Yeah. I don't even know where I am anymore, Carl. Thank you. Thank you for the Unlearning Curve. Yes. Okay. The Unlearning Curve podcast. We'll get that right one of these days. But so, yes, after you do all those socials, then you can reach out to us, and hopefully I won't screw it up next time, but we'll see. There's no guarantees on that.
You can always edit it in. Yeah. So it'll be like...
My mouth will be different. Yeah. It won't match up. So, Carl, can you kick us off, Carl? Because we're going to be talking about, adverse childhood experiences and adverse religious experiences.
Yeah. Let's say, welcome to the Learning Curve podcast.
That's right. Okay.
Yeah. So when we talked about abuse, we talked about trauma, the What is Trauma episode that we did, which as of this recording hasn't aired yet, but you'll see it. What is trauma? And we talked about the event. So you have the event and then the experience of that event and then the effect that it has on you, right? So we're talking about the events, the first part that causes the trauma. And it's when we can't regulate or when the caregiver's not there or the experience was just so violent or so severe that it causes an effect in your life, but you got to go back and look at those events. So first of all, we have adverse childhood experiences, which are known as ACEs. And I think in school, it's pretty common in public schools to test for those ACEs. It says, what are adverse childhood experiences? They are stressful or traumatic events such as neglect or violence. ACEs are strongly related to the brain development and a wide range of health problems throughout a person's lifetime. ACEs may include, but are not limited to, physical or sexual abuse, domestic violence, living in poverty, parental mental illness, and discrimination, substance use disorders, or incarceration. And that is from ocfs.ny.gov. And it has a publication, Understanding Diverse Childhood Experiences, 5222. That, if you look into that, has a ton of information in all kinds of different languages about ACEs and how that affects us. But I really wanted to move on. In our book, Evolving from Religious Trauma, we talked about ACEs briefly, but then we probably talked more about AREs, which are adverse religious experiences. You guys with me so far?
We're with you.
All right. So this is from GCRR, Global Center for Religious Research, .org. And it says, briefly stated, AREs are any experience of religious belief, practice, or structure that undermines an individual's sense of safety or autonomy and or negatively impact their physical, social, emotional, relational, and sexual or psychological well-being. These experiences have the potential of resulting in religious trauma. There are no set parameters to constituting an ARE. They're typically categorized in three different headings: abuse, neglect, and communal practices. What I noticed about this list more than anything was that abuse and neglect fall into basically four general categories, and it's always the same: emotional, verbal, physical, and sexual. So there's emotional abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Emotional neglect, verbal neglect, physical neglect, or sexual neglect. But then communal practices, which I'm assuming doesn't just apply to religion, but probably applies to many things. But there's just a whole list, a big list of things that happen in community that can be an event that has an adverse effect um, on your mental well-being, on your trauma. It could be community violence, but also bullying, threats, and intimidation. And churches never do that. I mean, they don't
I've
beat you
never
up.
heard of one.
They don't beat you up at the door, and pound you down till you believe. But there is intimidation, threats. Um, it mentions terrorism. That's a pretty extreme one. But public outing is definitely a part of the show. Stigmatizing, branding, forced confessions, or maybe we could say coerced, right?
Hmm.
It's not like they got your arm behind your back, but in a sense, sometimes mentally they do. Shunning and excommunication, brainwashing, forced indoctrination, which has its own set of bullets in here. You can read that again at gcrr.org. But one thing we were familiar with was love bombing and trauma bonding, which seemed like it happened at every church. We'd get love bombed on the way in, then we go through some traumatic stuff, and then we'd end up bonding over that trauma, instead of something more valid and more helpful. But there could be stalking and harassment, forced conversions, conversion therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Friend Seth Showalter wrote a book about that. Forced ritual performance, substance abuse, financial fraud, financial, sexual, or other forms of control. It's again, these events, people tend to dismiss those events and say, well, everybody has some events in their life. But the first point is, like we've said before, uh, it's how you experience that, and it's not like so you can say, well, see, it's just your experience. It's just how you took it. That's the problem. But it's not a conscious choice, right? It's this is what happened, and this is how it affected me. I wish it wouldn't have. I wouldn't have chose it. It's just how I coped at the time. It's how I survived. But there are events, whether we get to those events through typical talk therapy, whether we do it through a somatic therapy or whatever. I think it's important to address those events. Sometimes in somatic therapies, we don't even have to know exactly what was the adverse event, but we've got to access that and deal with it. Or it's like Laura says, it's going to come out sideways eventually, and it's going to affect you negatively.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Does any of that make sense?
It does, and I think like when the thing that I found interesting between the two, because ACEs, correct me if I'm wrong, is usually it's childhood,
Yeah.
and the AREs, it's not necessarily childhood either. So these can be things that continue to this is new trauma that we find as we
Yeah.
go through life. So it's not just relegated to our childhoods that
And I
screw
would
us up.
stress that churches like Greg Locke's church actually traumatize you or trigger you at least, and then they put their arm around you and help you regulate. In my opinion, that's creating more trauma. I mean, you're not helping anything by doing that. So I definitely think it happens
Mm-hmm.
all the time to adults as well. Yeah.
Well, I mean, even with when we talk about these with church, I think that it's churches often lay the groundwork for these very easily. I mean, and we've talked about this sometime before, but I mean, once you get into the idea of original sin, that we're all born uh, just damned to hell, and there's nothing good about us, and we're just pieces of shit in God's image. If just that fact, you are already putting people on a foundation of kind of asking to be abused. Not entirely, but it's one of those things. Okay, yeah, to be here, you have to realize you're nothing. You're garbage, and but the invisible one will make it all better.
Be used by God.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I feel like I feel like that's just a good groundwork for the
Yeah.
trauma, just
Yeah.
before we even get to
Set
any of
the
these things.
stage. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's just set the stage. You're going to be, and you're going to trust, you need to trust and obey. For there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. That was one of my favorite hymns
Oof.
back in the day, right? Because
Brought me back. Yeah,
it
not in a
worked
good way, but
well
it
for
brought
the
me back.
sales pitch at the end,
Yeah.
right? You just need to trust and obey.
Mm-hmm.
And in case you're having a hard time figuring out what God's saying, I'll tell you what He's saying, and you obey it. You
Mm-hmm.
trust. Don't question.
Well, and if you're also, to Stuart's point, if you're damned to hell, you're essentially refuse, then whatever anyone does to you doesn't really matter anyway. You probably deserved it because you're a piece of shit.
You caused it. You sure?
Yeah, or
your skirt was too short.
Yeah, or you brought it on yourself.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
And I think through this too, that and another aspect is that you add into this. It's been something that my wife and I have enjoyed doing in a very mocking way. But on Sunday mornings, like one of like the more popular radio stations,
Mock therapy.
Yeah, no, but one of the radio stations switches over to like Christian worship music just for like a couple hours on Sunday morning. So we'll just turn it on when we're out, and we just listen to it mockingly because we're just like, this is, if you really think about what all of these messages, like you mentioned, trust and obey, but when you think about all of this, it's indoctrination in this to where like, yeah, God's whatever troubles I'm in, God is going to fix them, going to pull me out of them. It's all going to be fine. Or I'm nothing, he is everything, he's given me everything. But if you logically think about that, God is giving me what does that even mean? Like, and that's half of what I say when we listen to like modern worship music. It's like, what does that even mean if you walk that out in practice? It sounds good, and it sounds like something we've been accustomed to hearing, but if you were to like really think about what you're saying here, no, this is like some weird codependent relationship with God. And
it's learned codependency.
Mm-hmm.
And it's indoctrinated, maybe even codependency. We learn how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I need my church. Well, you've been conditioned to need your church or your pastor or whatever. Exactly.
I'm worried about so-and-so. I haven't seen them at church in a few weeks. I mean, that's going to, okay, you could call them if you were really that worried about it. But the fact that you're saying this in church to others, I haven't seen them in church. It's one of those things where you're just, I mean, it's like a backhanded form of gossip too.
Yeah, you're leapfrogging in the hierarchy. Well, I didn't see them at church. Well, that means I was at church, so I must be better than them.
Yeah, so the deal with, unresolved trauma is that it's unresolved. So it takes up in our nervous system, so we say the body keeps the score. It's still there trying to be resolved because it couldn't be resolved at that time. And so it has to be addressed, or if it's, if it's mocked, not in the fun way you're talking about, but where it's just you, but if it's, made fun of where you're a snowflake, just get over it. Your feelings don't matter. We don't have time to address that. We got to put on the show. So Sarah Bessie said, the church didn't have room for my grief. They didn't have time to talk about that. They didn't have time to spend with that, being an empathetic witness for somebody else, or just sitting with people without giving them advice. It just, we want to say, well, everybody had a tough childhood. Everybody went through some adverse childhood experiences, and we've all probably had some adverse religious experiences as well. But, that's just how you took it. And, if you're, like you said, if you're a piece of garbage anyhow to start with, then what does it matter, right? Just pray to Jesus, then magically all that, you'll be a new creation in Christ. That's the doctrine, right? Old or passed away, the new has come. You're a new creation. You're all new. You're brand new. But no, we're not, because we still have trauma. We still have unresolved trauma. And it's still coming out sideways. And my wife and I are getting in an argument over nothing for no reason. Or I'm yelling at my kids, for something that's normal. I'm yelling at my dog. I've done that. JD corrects me on that. It's still there. It's still something, and we need to look at it. We need to understand it, and maybe try to get rid of these practices in religion, doctrinally, like Stuart said, the bad doctrine that adds to it, and also the practices, the traditions of the church that promote patriarchy and power differentials and more abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely worth finding out about and saying, am I involved in things that do that?
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's social media, like you guys talked about last time.
And I think even getting churches to the point of understanding that trauma is real, and it's not something that can just be prayed away. And I think it's just the way that we do this. We look to things, or we've been taught in these circles that, we're always looking for a miracle. We're always looking for something. And especially when it comes to our emotions and to the trauma that we've experienced that has messed with who we see we are, or it continues to mess with how we interact with other people. That's very real, and you're not going to sing it away. You're not going to pray it away. It goes back to, it takes work, and it is not easy, and it is uncomfortable, and it is messy, and you need people that are cool with that are cool with the mess.
I don't know if JD remembers when I used to tell him, things don't get better by doing nothing in most cases. If you just bypass it, which is what when religion gets uncomfortable, it bypasses. It makes up platitudes or excuses it or hopes for a miracle, like you said, miracle thinking and things like that. It's just bypassing, and bypassing doesn't usually ever make things better.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Might make you feel better for a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
Forget about it for a little bit while you listen to the worship song or something.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, you're just burying it, or just pushing it aside or burying it, which it always comes back later.
And with being that the church doesn't deal with any of those things and is a hierarchical, patriarchal structure, that you're generally just adding on to those things. So you're doing the opposite of working on them, is you're just making them worse by ignoring them.
Well, and even think about these. Think about, like, when I'm looking down the communal practices, it made me think of, I think we've talked about this before, but even things like purity rings, which that feels like that is just fodder for trauma. You march a bunch of children up on stage who are barely prepubescent, and everyone in the church is going to sit and look at how you're going to pledge to keep your legs closed and for Jesus. And I feel like that puts people in it's, you put them in a situation where they are bound to fail one way or the other. And I don't care if they're wait until marriage, but they're going to get caught up. Oh, in my head, I was thinking about, but you're creating trauma in that situation for them, and saying it's God that you're doing this for. And you're just giving them that and saying, go be a teenager. Here's some extra trauma too. Now that your whole community is looking at you in your silly little ring.
The other side of not bypassing it is not overly controlling it. Try to control people who have trauma, and we create more trauma for them. We may, like JD said, temporarily relieve it, right? By bypassing it or controlling it.
Take your mind off it, at least.
Take your mind off of it, and distraction from it. But it's going to come back. It's going to resurface, and it's going to be sideways, like Laura says, not in any kind of constructive way. You're just going to be yelling at each other and wondering why you're in this fight that you're in.
Yeah, I mean, to deal with any of that stuff, you'd have to have the tools, and obviously church is not going to teach you any of those tools to deal with it. They're not going to teach you how to talk things out, because that's not, even in Sunday school, that's not what happens. Because I remember from a very young age trying to discuss things or like ask genuine questions, and all I got was the stock rote answer. And so quickly I realized that, okay, I'm not going to engage in this in good faith. So I would just talk shit, get frustrated looks, but it was better than just sitting there and listening to the same answer I already knew. It's like a bad horror film in some ways, because I'm just like, the jump scare's coming, the fucking platitude is coming, like, and that was me at 12 years old, and I'm not some super genius or anything. Like, it's not that hard. It's ritualistic, and it's bullshit. But anyway, just frustrated with it.
Yeah.
Carl, I wanted to ask you a question too. I was curious on this list. It has, and I may be way too anal on this.
I don't know.
I was accused for being too anal earlier too. So, no, but they have brainwashing and forced indoctrination, and they have conversion therapy. Separate on that. And
Yeah.
so I was curious, like, where do you think of those lines where, I mean, I feel like conversion therapy is very much brainwashing and forced indoctrination, but I'm guessing there's aspects outside of that give it its own little special thing.
So for me personally, forced indoctrination, when people say, well, we're more progressive, we're not like the Southern Baptist Convention where we force racism and things like that. But you also do confirmation classes
Mm.
where you say, well, they don't have to do it, right? They could just be out of the club and not like any of their other siblings that went through it. It's that I need you to agree with my conclusions. We need you to, at a
Mm-hmm.
base level, agree with us so that we can pronounce that you're now a man or whatever, that you're now mature, that you're now saved, that you're now safe, or whatever your terminology is. I think in many ways there's forced indoctrination and brainwashing just by saying the same simple things over and over and over again with different emotions and so on. But what was the other part of your question?
No, I was just trying to compare contrast conversion therapy versus brainwashing
Yeah,
/ force
yeah.
indoctrination, because there's a Venn diagram, and I feel like they're almost just, wait, that's just one circle.
In case people don't know, tell them what conversion therapy is, because it doesn't have anything to do with salvation or spirituality. It has to do with being queer.
Yeah, it's the process of ungaying you, I guess, through therapy, through chance, through a bunch of manipulative processes.
Torture in some cases.
Yeah,
Yep.
taking
Yep.
you to a remote location and torturing you. A lot of times it was taught by drug rehab people, and not the same thing. I mean, has some similarities, maybe, right, to 12-step programs and things, but in my opinion, it's way worse.
I would say if you look at those aren't coming from like Alcoholics Anonymous. Those are like back into like the 80s and 90s. They had I don't know if I would say that conversion therapy is worse. I'd say they're equally bad, because it's basically the same thing as they'd have these tough on crime programs where they you know basically kidnap these kids, put them under the
Scared straight.
the tutelage
Yes.
of like 17, 18-year olds that have their own bullshit trauma, and then they just beat the fuck out of them or lock them in rooms naked and spray them with cold water. It's just
It's like the alpha male thing. Right?
No, but it's perfect, Carl. You called it scared straight. That is what they're trying to do with conversion therapy. They're trying to scare you straight.
Yeah, that was a real thing.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't.
We're always trying to figure out how old Stuart is. He told us, but I don't believe him because he looks so much younger. But his wisdom is way beyond.
Is this love bombing? Are we on the love
That's
bombing?
right.
So
We're
we're on that stage.
trying to indoctrinate you, though. Got to soften you out. Love bombing is a real thing.
Yeah.
Laura used to say that terrified her when people, during the first part of being a pastor, the first year, the honeymoon or whatever you call it, where people would just go, wow, so glad you're here. Because we're in a rural area, right? Hard to get a pastor here. We're in trouble, we're failing. Come help us. And they would just love bomb us. And the Lord would say, oh, that's not good. But you're putting Carl up on that pedestal, and, then you just tell him he's the greatest and his sermons are so good and blah, blah, blah. Right? I don't know. JD, did you see that too?
Yeah, for sure. I feel like the adults would do it. I got it less from my peers though, because we kind of all just hung out there. But yeah, I definitely saw it with you guys. I think I would be interested to see what Abby and Lily would say about this, but I was like not a good kid. I feel like pretty quickly they were like not happy to have me around.
You weren't bad.
It wasn't bad. Like I wasn't like mainlining heroin or something, but I would talk back, and like I think a lot of my teachers and a lot of the Sunday school teachers and stuff probably weren't like elated to have me in class. I wasn't like the golden child, so I don't think that
was because you were a bad kid. I think it's just that you question things, and that wasn't acceptable.
In the church, I was I wasn't a terrible kid. I was a shithead sometimes.
And the principal said, I heard your son cussing. Pastor's kid. How can he be, I told him, you're a pastor's kid. How can you be doing it? So I almost dismissed that totally when the principal said that, because he was just shaming, right? And it wasn't anything real productive. But I thought you were a pretty good kid. That's the story I tell.
You're ruining his cred. You're ruining his street cred right now.
We don't have any street cred anymore.
Yes.
Not a bad boy.
Yes.
It could be a dating technique too.
No, it's funny you mentioned love bombing, and I think it's one of the things I can see it. I don't think I've ever experienced it, and it doesn't mean it never happened to me, but I think because of my trauma from my ACEs and Rs, or AREs, I feel like I have a hard time taking compliments anyways. And so if there was love bombing, I'd just be like, okay, no. But that's, it's a gift of other trauma. You start getting like a trauma cocktail. It's fun. It's fun.
You don't really mean that.
Yeah.
That's good. But then, then inevitably, this is what I noticed just in my situation. Then after a while, the honeymoon's over. Then we have a blow up, right? And we argue, or we say some things we shouldn't have said. Then we apologize. And to me, that's kind of trauma bonding. Not exactly, but then we've been through something. That's what we say. We did some, kind of earned God's favor by going through this tough thing that was based on our trauma and our dysfunction and everything else. And then we've got that in common now. We've been through some shit together. So now we're kind of bonding over that.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's not terrible, bad things, but it's things at the wrong time for the wrong reasons and so on. Right?
Yeah. And I think just being able to push out that this stuff is real, even though I know we're reading it, but I know a lot of people that have been through stuff, like you'd mentioned, like, just suck it up. This is real. Like the first time I talked to a therapist, within they're like, well, because I was like, I deal with depression and anxiety and stuff. And then I think as soon as I started mentioning anything about like, oh yeah, I was raised Christian home, conservative, dad was always heavily involved, which means we were heavily involved. They were like, yep. And it was just like one of those ones where like, okay, I'm getting you right away. Yep. Okay. Yep. So, I mean, I think it's more common than we want to admit, but I feel like it's these kind of things too that we ignore, and we just suck it up and say there's something wrong with me. If I got abused and hurt by this church, it was just because we've heard this so many times. It's not God, it's just people. And, people hurt people, but God doesn't. And so you just need to find a better community to just restart the process again. Of getting, Yeah.
Or was God's plan, or God uses terrible situations, or whatever other fucking stupid platitude they want to throw out.
Into the story. He has better seats. We heard that already in this series.
And I think that alone in it can probably just tell us where trauma starts, where we're like, bad things are happening. Well, don't worry. God says this.
Just ignore it.
Yeah. And, or just the platitudes, and it, and it doesn't heal the wound. It doesn't make you even mentally feel better after it, but you're just told, well, there must be something wrong with me because I don't have the right perspective.
It also makes the pastor and deacon's job easier and makes them have to deal with less shit.
Mm-hmm.
So it's nice for them.
Mm-hmm.
Good. So, an over focus on the events, like sometimes talk therapy can be a circular thing where we keep revisiting the same trauma. So again, I'm not an expert. I'm a participant. I'm a practitioner. That's what I would say. But so an overfocus, a revisiting of the trauma over and over and over again can cause us some issues also, right? But we've got to look at it. We've got to at least consider it. Say, this happened in my life. What effect is it having now on me? And sometimes it's not even that logical of an analysis, just an experiencing of it. And then we can integrate and move on.
I mean, yeah, it's hard, but therapy can help people. Yeah, exactly. I highly recommend it.
I'm pro therapy also, especially if it's trauma informed. therapy. And go back to the other episode and talk about what is trauma, and you'll maybe find out the difference. If not, I think you can find it on your own. What is trauma informed? What is trauma responsive? How can our churches be more trauma informed and trauma responsive? That would be like the accomplishment of the century. If our churches could be trauma informed, trauma responsive, and plan and be proactive about avoiding traumatizing people further.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, they'd have to change some of their beliefs, like
And-
you mentioned before.
Yeah, and posture and
yeah,
hierarchy.
yeah, exactly.
Well, it may make large sense. It may make them somewhat obsolete as well. So,
Mhm.
Yeah.
probably not in their best interest,
Mm.
at least financially. Speaking of, this is one thing I don't like about this. Immediately right after this, it starts to try to sell you shit. I don't like that.
Oh,
Buy
yeah.
now.
Where are you on? Okay, I'll cut this
on that religious trauma thing. When I scroll
There's
down,
ads?
what I want to see when I scroll down to the end of this is like how to fix this, and all they have is buy our book. That makes me upset. That's not to discount any of the stuff. I agree with everything that's in here. I just don't like you immediately trying to sell me shit.
Yeah.
Old habits die hard.
I would say there's also other sources than GCRR, but this is the one I started with because it has the most information in it.
I think it's
Keep looking, keep searching.
This idea, I think, is also somewhat, at least in this terminology, is somewhat new, because I was doing some searches for like peer-reviewed studies and stuff, and there's a little bit on it, but they often don't use this terminology. But they do talk about, obviously, religious trauma is a big topic, but I think it's relatively new in terms of like the parlance. So yeah, I need to look more into it. But yeah, I think it's undeniable that obviously this is a serious problem and has been for a long time in various religions.
Yeah, I think when you think of like religious trauma, like in the past, like you're mentioning that too, what would you assume? Like, oh, it was just the stigmata. That was probably that was a traumatic thing, and that was generally things like that, right? It was get the bloody palms, but
and I also should probably mention it was a religious person that taught me how to deal with my trauma. It was Benedictine nuns who were a little bit renegade in their approaches and philosophies and so on. They're very against patriarchy. Their religion is full of. But anyway, just to make that point.
I love it. Rogue nuns.
Yeah.
It sounds fun.
But it is possible within religion to change. But like you said, you may have to give up most of your beliefs, and a lot of your traditions and culture. And patriarchy doesn't go down easy. They don't like being questioned even, and they don't like to change.
Yeah, no hierarchy does, I don't think.
Yeah.